Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I'm Brian, and I'm here with special guest co-host Clint Greenwood. Hey, Clint, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Brian. How are you?
Good. Thanks for coming on the show. So, everybody, welcome to episode 17 of the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. So, before we introduce our guest, let me explain why we brought Clint on tonight. First off, Aaron wasn't able to be on. He's got a prior commitment. But more importantly, tonight's topic kind of felt like it was one of those, need to phone a friend kind of shows. So I decided to get somebody who's actually been doing some hacking with the platform to give us some initial insight. So Clint, thanks for being on, and appreciate your insight tonight. So our first guest tonight is Dave McCrory. Dave is the senior architect on the Cloud Foundry platform as a service at VMware. Dave, thanks for being on tonight. Great to have you as a guest.
Thank you, Brian. Glad to be here.
Guys, let's talk a little bit about Cloud Foundry. Let's talk about platform as a service. But before we jump into Cloud Foundry, Dave, you've got a pretty interesting background. A lot of startups, a lot of interesting technology. Can you give us some background about you? And then maybe last week we had some of the guys from Dell, and specifically Rob Hirschfeld. And Rob mentioned that you and him are sort of co-founders of cloud computing for various reasons, either patent reasons or technology reasons, or just sort of joking around.
Sure. So you're right, Brian. My background involves about 10 years of startups and then a brief stint at Dell before I came on board at VMware. I started a company in New Orleans with Rob Hirschfeld called ProTier. That was back in 1999, right at the height of the dot-com bubble days. And we actually did hosting. We were an application service provider when that was in vogue. We used Citrix Metaframe and did quite a bit with trying to get different software companies to run their software on our ASP service. We ultimately became involved with VMware at that time, and that's when they were alpha testing what would become ESX Server. I ended up installing the first copy of ESX outside of the walls of VMware and actually getting it to work. After that, in talking to some of the people at VMware, Rob and I decided to look at writing software to manage ESX. At the time, there was no concept of vCenter or anything else, so we started down that path and started to write management software to manage our own ESX hosted environment. And down that path, we actually filed several patents around logical virtualized server clouds. So those are actually granted patents around using virtual machines and cloud and the idea of on-the-fly provisioning resources. So that's why Rob and I call ourselves the father of cloud. We were actually doing that back in 2001.
Wow, that's an interesting story. So you knew the VMware people back when it was probably 3 or 4 people just getting out of Stanford University.
Just prior to that, there were probably 30 people maybe when we were involved. There was one inside salesperson. They had launched Workstation, but that was about it. There was no GSX server, no ESX, but the team was still pretty small. You could fit everyone into one room.
Wow, interesting. Very good. So let's sort of jump ahead to the future. Today you're working with Cloud Foundry, which is probably, if not the most, one of the most kind of exciting and most talked about platforms. So it was announced back in April. Lots of buzz. You guys have put together a kind of a rock star team. So yourself and Derek and a slew of other people, the people from the Spring acquisition. It's open source, which is really kind of a different development model and a different business model for VMware. Can you give folks kind of a high-level overview of Cloud Foundry and sort of where it stands? What's the status in terms of it being in beta or moving to GA? Maybe who some of the early adopters are, or how strong the early adopter kind of following's been?
We've had kind of an interesting response from the community in that there have been so many different people interested in so many different facets of Cloud Foundry. Realize, as you had alluded to, that It's a new business model for VMware. Cloud Foundry is actually the first open source project to come entirely out of VMware itself, not through acquisition. In fact, the only portion of Cloud Foundry that was an acquisition in and of itself was the name. Spring Source had acquired a company called Cloud Foundry, and the name was kept, but that was it as far as the technology. Everything else was designed, written, built inside of VMware and became an open source project. So very different than something like vSphere or anything of that sort. The what you'll find is there's going to be a lot of different news over the next couple of weeks,
Sure.
all the way through VMworld, as we always have lots of announcements during VMworld. So I don't think that'll be a big surprise to anyone.
Right.
There will also be a lot of news coming out about how Cloud Foundry is being used. I think you'll hear some really interesting things. Can't talk about them just yet, but it's a matter of days before I will be able to.
Okay, very cool. So you mentioned there's a ton of people that are kind of showing interest in it. I know there's been a lot of different vendors or companies. So everything from last week we talked to the Dell guys, and they were talking about how you guys had written a bar clamp for Crowbar. I know there's some of the management tool guys like in Stratus and others are starting to be able to manage deployments of Cloud Foundry and so forth. I brought Clint on this week because Clint, as sort of a developer, not so much as a vendor, but as a developer, has been playing with it. Clint, what part of it, from a developer's perspective, is interesting for you?
Well, I mean, the biggest part that, let's say on April 12th, that kind of shook me was one thing Dave's already touched on. That's the fact that it was open. And when they say open, they mean truly open in the sense I can go out to GitHub and I can pull the code down. And on April 12th, when they were talking about it, it was later that day that I had the code down and running on my laptop. So it was exciting in that nature. And then the other thing would be the openness from a framework perspective. That it could be Ruby, it could be Java, Node.js, Sinatra, you name it. There were multiple framework and language support that was pretty exciting. I guess one question I would have for Dave on that, though, is while, kind of polyglot programming and programmers are kind of vogue right now, in the enterprise space, that's really not the case, right? Typically, enterprises are almost divided between .NET or Java. They've sworn allegiance to one of the two technologies because they can't manage the change of multiple languages in their environment. Are you seeing that with Cloud Foundry as you reach out to the enterprises, or are folks opening up to other things like Ruby, for example, that was and is really hot on the startup scene?
I will say that I had previously believed exactly what you just said, Clint, around enterprises being either and Java /.NET shops. And what I've found is that the problem is that enterprises are saying we need to build some applications, specifically web-enabled applications, quickly. They have a need, whether it be for an iPhone-style mobile app that needs some type of backend, or they actually need a website with a bunch of integrations, and they're hiring consulting companies to initially build these things. The consulting companies are trying to build them as rapidly as possible. They end up doing it in Rails, and what you end up with ultimately is the company having a pocket of Rails developers that ends up growing inside of the organization because they're able to so quickly build these web apps. That doesn't mean that Ruby or Node or something else is going to take over the world tomorrow, but it shows that depending on what work needs to be done, different languages are lending themselves to get that job done more rapidly and easily. And so at the Rails conference I was at in Baltimore a couple of months ago, they were asked how many people were sent there by their companies, and how many of those companies were large companies, and over half of the people raised their hands. So while I don't think it's in every enterprise, I think that the number is growing to a far larger number than people realize.
As you explained it like that, and I think that's a keen observation, because definitely while I was at GE, while Java and .NET were the primary languages, we were hacking away in the corner with Ruby, for example, and Ruby on Rails, because that's what the cool kids do. It sounds very analogous to the cloud argument in the sense that IT kind of has their hands bound, if you will, by bureaucracy and protocol, and folks are going around that, like shadow IT, to Amazon and things like that to get the job done. Would you say that's accurate?
I would say that's reasonably accurate. There are definitely similarities between the two. This might be a little bit less under the radar in that there might be more sanctioned activities, but still, I would say it's probably a lot closer to having to get a job done that's seemingly impossible otherwise, and so
Right.
people find ways around it.
Okay.
So, Dave, I guess a couple of the really interesting things about Cloud Foundry, at least at a real high level, that get people its attention is, one, it's open source, and the idea that not only can I go in, get the bits, code to it, change it, do all the things that you can typically do with open source, but you guys are very committed to enabling it to run in a public environment, whether that's cloudfoundry.com or whether it's on top of something else like AWS or wherever. But you've also made sort of commitments that it'll be enabled to run, say, on ESX in a private environment. So customers will have that sort of flexibility and portability. So that jumps out at a lot of people as being really interesting, very unique, giving them potentially a lot of flexibility. And the other one is all these support for all these different languages and frameworks. Does the languages and frameworks, having to support so many of them, does that make it more challenging for you guys, or is the architecture built in a way that people can keep adding them? Like Erlang got added and Scala got added, and some things beyond just Java and Ruby are there. Is the architecture going to be able to scale to keep dealing with that, or will certain language just win out over time?
Well, the architecture is absolutely designed to support any language or framework that you choose. Some are more difficult to add than others, as far as adding the .NET languages would take more work, but is certainly doable. And the biggest thing is getting community participation so that we don't have to enable and support all of those languages inside of VMware in and of itself. And that's why we had to pick a few languages that we came out with at launch. There's a limited amount of time and expertise to work on each language and incorporate them, which is actually why Erlang got added so quickly, as someone wrote the correct bindings and integrations so that we could integrate Erlang, and we were able to accept what's called a pull request, which is where someone makes the necessary changes for us to be able to add that specific runtime to the Cloud Foundry environment. We have several other pending pull requests that you'll see accepted soon that will add additional languages to Cloud Foundry. And you're right, we did add Scala, and we also have we've had people running JRuby, and arguably there'll be several other languages online soon. The goal behind Cloud Foundry is to get as many different languages and frameworks supported, and it's also to have Cloud Foundry be able to be run anywhere. So that's one of the things that differentiates our strategy, is making it entirely open. As you said, cloudfoundry.com runs on vSphere today, and we run the Cloud Foundry open source code on cloudfoundry.com. That's what our PaaS provides. But at the same time, we have partners that deploy Cloud Foundry on all sorts of other things. RightScale deploys it on AWS. We've got Enstratus supporting a whole bunch of other clouds that Cloud Foundry can be deployed on top of. And I don't know if you saw the news last week or not, but Ubuntu is going to, in an upcoming release, support deployment of Cloud Foundry on anything that you can deploy Ubuntu on. So our goal is ubiquity, not lock-in.
Yeah, so that piece is very, very interesting, and I'm sure to a certain extent it's exciting for customers because they say, look, flexibility is great, and I have to imagine if you're a VMware systems integrator or like a current VMware systems integrator or reseller, or it's a little bit, maybe, I don't want to say unnerving, but it's a little different for you because you've been selling ESX for a long time and you're sort of used to selling that benefit and value. Do you guys get kind of direction from the ESX, from the vCenter, vCloud team for the Cloud Foundry team to sort of own that integration with Cloud Foundry between, say, vCloud and Cloud Foundry, or are they trying to drive it, or what's the coordination? I mean, obviously you guys want to be really open, but there's got to, I would imagine there's got to be people within VMware that are also trying to make sure that if a customer chooses an all VMware environment, that it is really tightly integrated, or it has the ability to be really tightly integrated. Is that your team's driving, or is other people in VMware driving that?
I think you'll hear more about that in the next few weeks.
Okay, that's fair. One of the unique things I've heard Derek talk about, Derek Collison, who's your CTO and one of the original team members, he's talked about Cloud Foundry being unique because you use this concept of containers, which some other PaaS platforms don't use. What does that mean? What does containers do for Cloud Foundry, and what's the technology behind that?
It's actually kind of the reverse. We actually don't apply a containering technology per se. We've taken an approach in Cloud Foundry that we have multiple layers of isolation, but the layers actually are processes in Linux. So if you think about user land process and running a runtime in a user land process with file ACLs isolating the user mode and where the actual application runs, we isolate it in that way, and then we have isolation with the virtual machines if you are running it on a virtual machine. And what you can do is you can actually configure each what we call a DEA, which is what can load up your application. So when you push your application up to Cloud Foundry, you're sending us your code. And so when we get that code, we will end up ultimately, after doing a whole bunch of processing and things and looking at the code, we will deploy it out to a DEA. And so the DEAs themselves can be configured one of two ways. They can be configured for single tenancy or multi-tenancy. Single tenancy, you would be focusing more on process isolation with VMs, versus multi-tenancy, where you would be focused on more pure process isolation and less around the VM itself providing the isolation. And all of that is to address the Coke or Pepsi the Coke/Pepsi problem of Coke and Pepsi would never allow you to deploy them on the same VM, even if you were doing some type of process isolation or something else. Right. They would want their own. So we do an account binding, and so if you set single tenancy on, you're able to solve that problem. So that's really the way the isolation works inside of Cloud Foundry today.
Okay, so it's very much driven based on somewhat of the application, but somewhat of what the environment's going to be, where you want it to run, how secure you want it to be, availability or expandability. Is that?
Well, it doesn't involve really the availability and expandability. Those are two components that are actually separated out, and no matter if you're running in single tenant or multi-tenant mode, you can still gain those benefits from the system.
So one of the things, I was watching a video the other night with Derek on it, I think it was Ruby Conference 2010, and he was talking about VMforce, which, my understanding is kind of the ancestor, if you will, of Cloud Foundry, and talked about stem cell virtual machines where they can quickly spin up VMs based off of this stem cell type of scenario. Is that still utilized within Cloud Foundry?
The idea of spinning up the virtual machines today with Cloud Foundry and what we explain to people is centered around creating effectively a pool of DEAs, and you can create those pools in advance. So think of it as a Slack pool, right? And people have done this with VMs for, gosh, since I started using them, where you have some VMs that are already online, and so what happens is when you shove your code up, the way Cloud Foundry works, it will decide algorithmically where it can most rapidly deploy your VM. Our idea of where an application can be deployed is any of the DEAs. So all of our DEAs operate the same way. They all support all of the different runtimes that CloudFoundry.com supports. You can configure it so that you have a pool, say, of DEAs that only support Java, and another pool that only support Ruby, for example. And in those cases, when you do a deploy, it would only the machines that have the ability to bootstrap that runtime would be the VMs that would be able to respond to that request. That's the way it works today.
One of the concepts you have written about in the past, it's been a couple of months on your blog, was something called data gravity. And you sort of talk about this idea that we're beginning to build more distributed applications because of the cloud, multiple cloud providers. We've got this sort of unique ability to move things around, but at some point we come back to this idea that the data ends up being kind of the most difficult thing to move. You run into speed of light issues and bandwidth issues, and so that's still sort of a bottleneck. If you can't just instantaneously move 10 terabytes of data from cloud provider A to B. Is there anything within Cloud Foundry? Obviously, you're not solving speed of light things and physics things, but is there anything within the Cloud Foundry framework that starts to address that challenge as you talked about in your blog?
Yes and no. So yes, there are some aspects that can be addressed, and that would be not having to modify the stateless code that you execute in the cloud. So by not having to modify the code at all for services to come online the same way, makes it easier to move or hand off or divide your data, which makes data gravity not quite as powerful. Another aspect of trying to deal with data gravity is to design your applications to leverage things that can at least hide some of data's gravitational pull. So that would be like a content delivery network or something like that, where it caches it's simple caching, right? The most frequently used data that's cached in a CDN, for example, could give the appearance that an app or its data is still in one place, even though it's been moved to another. But ultimately, it comes down to wherever the majority of the data is and the majority of the services that want to consume that data, they're going to be drawn to where the largest mass of that data is. And that's what happens with Google or Amazon or any of the other big services. If you're running an application that depends on, let's say you create an application that depends on Facebook, the closer to Facebook servers you can get, the better your app's going to perform. The faster or lower latency it will be, and the higher the bandwidth you should be able to get. And so one thing that Cloud Foundry does let you do is set up a platform as a service closer to those data sources more easily. And it also lets you set up that same thing behind your firewall in your enterprise. So in that aspect, yes, it helps with data gravity, but ultimately you're going to have some, planetary bodies that are bigger and have greater gravitational pulls than others, and it becomes more difficult to get away.
Sure. So it's I joked around with with James Urquhart, who's a colleague of mine. I know you know James. James always likes to sort of say, no, there's no cloud layer. There's the applications are the applications. There's no cloud layer. And I was sort of trying to point out to him, well, that's all well and good, but there are still sort of additional layers that have to be thought about, and I think you sort of point out some of those, right? It's a placement layer, it's a CDN or a caching layer. I mean, there's some things there to go from the application works to the application works really well, or it's really well optimized. The cool thing that you guys have done is you've made it so you don't have to think about changing it when you move it or place it, but there is still some element of, if you want to go from it runs well to it runs fantastic, there's some other sort of architectural design considerations. Is that fair enough?
Yes, I would say it's fair enough. It's the magic is where you choose to do that. If you choose to do that in the infrastructure, or if you choose to do that in the application.
Okay.
So the application, think about if you took a 3-tier application and deployed it directly onto any of the cloud solutions, including Cloud Foundry, by the way. You could deploy a 3-tier, say, Java app. That Java app will act the same way it does in your environment as is. If you rewrote that application to take better advantage of the services and the design patterns that follow cloud, so make it more distributed at all of the different layers, it would actually perform better, would be more resilient, self-healing, etc. And that has to do with the application logic. The way you could, in the short term, deal with it if you weren't able to rewrite it entirely would be to layer in things like caching and other things to help. So it depends on how you choose to design that logic as to where the abstraction and performance gains can be had. There's a place for both.
Okay. Shift gears a little bit, and this actually might be a question that is better handled by James Waters or somebody in the business development team. But for example, Clint's got a son who's in college right now. He's studying computer science. He's hacking away in his free hours when he's not, off drinking beer or chasing girls or whatever. You guys are talking about trying to build up a community around people that help grow Cloud Foundry. You're obviously looking for people that are going to use the platform to develop new applications. Is VMware doing stuff at, say, the university level or in places to really kind of foster new people, sort of the next generation of developers to think about using a platform like Cloud Foundry? I mean, I know at one point Google had some guys, I think they eventually became the Cloudera guys, but who were trying to teach kids how to use Hadoop-like, map-like reduce tools. Is that going on? Is VMware, are you guys far enough along to start thinking about that, or are things just way, way, way too early and you're way too busy to be thinking about that?
So we have begun a couple of programs to outreach to universities to allow them to begin classes where they're able to leverage Cloud Foundry as a platform. So we have started doing that, and VMware obviously has numerous intern programs.
Sure.
And at least the latest group of interns did do quite a few projects on top of Cloud Foundry, writing different things to do. I saw dozens of different interesting applications.
Oh, cool.
So we are starting to do that, but we are at the very early stages of that. So it'll get better and better, but we've just, like I said, we've just begun to go down that path.
Sure. How are you guys able to sort of disclose how big is the Cloud Foundry team these days?
Cannot disclose numbers, but I can disclose that we are actively hiring, and if people are interested and have a good development background, then we're certainly willing to talk to you. And we have lots of job postings on the different VMware properties looking for people.
Very cool. So if anybody needs good development skills, I think it's probably like vmware.com/jobs, I would guess, something along those lines. So we'll find it, and we'll put a link in our show notes to it for people that are interested.
So hey, let me jump in and ask a question here. We've talked about some of the elements of the Cloud Foundry architecture. So, like the DEA, we've alluded to the cloud controller, health manager, things like that. Out of those, are all of those written in Ruby? So, from a language perspective or choice, were all of those written in Ruby, or are there multiple languages supporting the PaaS infrastructure that is Cloud Foundry?
The absolute truth is that all of Cloud Foundry is written in Ruby. To my knowledge, the only component we rely on a couple of libraries that Ruby uses that are written in C, and Ruby itself has an interpreter that's written in C. Outside of that, everything is indeed written in Ruby, to my knowledge.
Are the C libraries the event machine?
That's one of the libraries.
Okay.
There's some serialization and some other libraries, I believe, that are also written in C as well. But the majority, 95+% of the code is written in Ruby, and standard Ruby and Rails applications have C libraries incorporated into them in some of the gems. So it's not an out of the ordinary thing. If you're a Ruby developer, all of the code looks the way you would expect it. In fact, several of the Ruby guys that I've spent time with have said that the code's actually very readable and easy to understand. It's not spaghetti code.
From a monitoring perspective, one of the things, when I was a developer back in the day, developing an application is one thing and it has its struggles. But once you push that thing out into production, it grows 8 heads, and it takes a lot more effort to maintain the same service levels that you initially saw. What I haven't really seen from Cloud Foundry is that visibility into what's going on across that application stack, if you will. I mean, I know that Hyperic was announced and has a plugin for it. What other monitoring capabilities do you have for Cloud Foundry?
Today, we don't have hundreds of different monitoring offerings or capabilities for that matter. We intend to improve several things about Cloud Foundry. One of them, for example, is logging. We don't do the best job of logging every single aspect of the system today. What we did do was to try and make it easier to test your app before you deploy it to make sure that you don't have issues. And if you do have an issue and you correct it, we have tried to make it so that you could seamlessly upgrade your app while it stayed up. Which is possible on Cloud Foundry as well. So if you write an app for Cloud Foundry with the following the correct design patterns, you can keep the app up and do upgrades without any downtime to your app, without changing the architecture or anything else beneath. So think of getting the benefits of what something like vMotion or something like that would give you, or HA, with doing it purely in software at the platform and above layer. That's something you can do today with Cloud Foundry. So while it can't give you the best reports on utilization or something like that out of the gate, you do get a lot of advantages in being able to get some resilience and apply fixes. And again, that's why the service is beta, right? We're still working on that.
No, that wasn't. I wasn't digging. I was. It was more just a question. Didn't know if there was something right around the corner. If maybe I had missed something.
There are things in the works, but you haven't missed anything, or at least you haven't missed anything that I haven't missed as well.
I guess one of the questions I would ask from a feature perspective, we all kind of as developers have little things that we like about a particular language or framework. More than something else. What's something that gets you excited about a specific feature, let's say, that gets you excited about Cloud Foundry, or that you could wax eloquent about for hours on end?
I think probably the biggest thing for me is purely the fact that it's written in Ruby and that I can control all aspects of it and customize them to my liking. And so that includes both the client and the server side. So the VMC client is written purely in Ruby, and you can do some interesting things by scripting the VMC client and making it work with Cloud Foundry itself. And some of that is actually around not only automation, but being able to add functionality, etc., to the system. That's something that really gets me excited. It's something that is the foundation for a session proposal I submitted for RubyConf, which was accepted. So that's something that I could go on and on about, are the possibilities and options based on that ability to leverage Ruby in so many ways. And it's also interesting to note that there are other Ruby libraries out there that integrate as well with VMware. There's a VMware employee that wrote a Ruby library that will allow you to control vCenter and vSphere using Ruby as well.
Now, Dave, I want to be very conscious of your time because, as we mentioned early on, you're very busy as it is, and then with VMworld coming up, things always kind of get stepped up and get crazy. So I want to throw one last question out at you, and maybe we'll try and wrap this up a little bit. You've been really, really helpful. I know we've bounced all over the place with the platform. Obviously, what Cloud Foundry's, who you guys talk to, who sort of your target audience is very much developers. As you mentioned, consultants, maybe systems integrators. That's not traditionally kind of the VMware audience necessarily, or the people who are selling and deploying traditional VMware ESX and so forth. As you've been out on the road, right? So you talked about sort of part of your time's in Palo Alto, but part of your time's out on the road, whether it's at conferences or elsewhere. Have you run into very many either customers or companies, VMware partners, if you will, that are starting to kind of have both of those skill sets to start to think about both of them, or is it still kind of very, very developer centric and the two worlds are still pretty far apart between, say, infrastructure and the developers?
So it's interesting that you say that. You're right in that people think of traditional VMware as being right. It's a VI admin world, virtualization, right. vSphere, and that's the world that I came from. That's not the whole story, though. If you think about the Spring Source acquisition and Spring, and prior to that, there was quite a bit of SDK work that went in for all of the partners of VMware to be able to integrate with vSphere and vCenter and all of that.
True.
There is a development history with VMware. It's just hasn't been in the spotlight, and platform as a service, in my view, is the thing that begins to bring together the aspects of the administration side of IT and the developer / engineer side of IT. And something I, in fact, got into a discussion about, I guess it was a couple of weeks ago on Twitter, was around the fact that I see platform as a service as being a contract between developers and operations. So if you think about or you hear about DevOps, I think of PaaS as being the actual instantiation of what it is that makes up DevOps. Not 100%, but a lot of it. And it's the developers know that they have to write their code to work on this specific platform, and operations knows what that platform is and what they need to do to operate, manage, maintain, roll out, deploy, etc. that platform and support it. And that relationship, I think, is what makes PaaS so powerful and so important. And at the same time, we are starting to talk to customers that are looking at this and do want to deploy at least what I'd call their first stages of platform as a service. I'm not aware of thousands of enterprises that have already adopted and deployed production platform as a service everywhere. I think we're early in the market. That's where I like to be, and I think that's where it is. Now, a few years from now, 18 months to 36 months from now, we might see a lot more adoption.
Yep. Yep. No, and that's what I was kind of curious about is you're seeing some early adopters. You're starting to see the groups that say, look, I know that I need to kind of fuse those two domains together, and that's positive, and that's obviously what platform as a service enables for people, and it's a matter of them wrapping their heads around, oh wow, this is really, really powerful. So that's interesting. I mean, that's a good thing for VMware because they're sort of eating from both sides of the table, if you will, and give customers flexibility of where they want to go and how fast they want to evolve their skills. So that's very, very cool.
Well, if you think about IT, they want to be on a level playing field with the cloud. Right,
Yep,
and they want
absolutely.
they do want to provide services that are like the cloud providers internally. They just haven't had a viable way of doing it. This begins to take them down a path of having that viable way of doing that.
Very cool. Well, listen, I want to again thank you so much for giving us the time tonight and being so open with questions and sort of giving us some insight. Obviously, next week's VMworld, without sort of having to let folks know where you're going to be, because obviously you get really, really busy. What's the Cloud Foundry presence going to be at VMworld? Where can people go? Is there going to be a separate booth just for Cloud Foundry, or are there certain sessions that people should be looking for to go get some insight?
There will be a booth. It will be one of the pods inside of the VMware mothership
Okay, cool.
presence on the exhibitor floor.
Right in the middle.
That's right. And in addition to that, there are quite a few. There are CAP sessions, Cloud Application Platform sessions. I'm giving 3 of them. There's some other great speakers as well that'll be talking about moving up onto the cloud and using the cloud. I would encourage everyone to sign up for sessions. If everyone doesn't realize, you must sign up in advance for sessions this year, which is new. And if you don't, you won't be able to get into the session.
Yep, no standing room only this year.
That's right.
Well, very cool. So, where can people, if people want to follow you on Twitter or on your blog, where can they follow you on the internet?
The best place is on Twitter. It's my last name, which is on Twitter. That's my handle. So it's at McCrory. It's McCrory. And my blog is blog.mccrory.me. And that's it.
Very cool. Well, Dave, again, thank you so much for being on. Clint, thanks for co-piloting this thing. I appreciate the input, and guys, this is an exciting area. It's a space that driving new applications. It's driving new things for people's business, and very exciting to watch what's going on. And if you're going to VMworld next week, definitely go check out the Cloud Foundry guys. And let us know what your feedback is. So again, Dave, thank you very much. So for everybody out there listening, thanks for being on tonight. You can follow us on Twitter at thecloudcastnet. You can always follow us on the web, www.thecloudcast.net. You can follow us on Stitcher. You can find us on iTunes. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week.